My name is Sarah Butts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Grand Challenges for Social Work Initiative. I'm here to welcome you to Grand Challenges for Social Work webinar series. This is our 7th webinar. In this series, in this webinar, we're going to focus on harness technology for social good. We have Dr. Jonathan Singer, Associate Professor at the School of Social Work, Loyola University in Chicago. Dr. Singer is the co-lead for the Harness Technology Grand Challenges Network, along with Stephanie Berzin, Claudia Colton, and Melanie Sage. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Singer.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to talk with everybody about this grand challenge, Harness Technology for Social Good, and to talk through some of the ideas that were involved in the development of the 2 working papers, and also some of the ideas about where we are going as a social work profession with technology. Sorry, go back. This is the information about the network co-leads. Everybody's happy to talk to you if you have questions. So the first question, why is technology a grand challenge? So first, the professional reach of social workers is unparalleled in human service delivery. So there are between 650,000 and 850,000, depending on who you talk to, social workers that are active in the United States. And these social workers are in every single part of the service delivery profession. We're also in every part of policy, of community organizing. Our reach is unparalleled. What we train folks to do and what we are able to think through has an impact on literally millions and millions of people every day. So what we're doing is we're thinking about social work as a profession and the reach that we have. Also, I want to say that I hear somebody in the background, so please make sure that you're muting your mics because this is being recorded for posterity. Most tech scholarship and practice information comes from outside of social work. So even though social work has an unparalleled reach, most of the information that's being generated about how to integrate social work and technology, how to think about technology and policy is being generated in other disciplines. Now, there's nothing wrong with other disciplines. Social work is inherently an interdisciplinary profession. We love the contributions that our colleagues in psychology and public health and nursing and medicine and counseling and psychiatry have been making, but our code of ethics is different. Our perspective on working with the most marginalized and vulnerable in society is different. And so it's important that as we move forward, we're not only thinking about mobilizing the workforce, we're also thinking about how we're adding to the conversation so that when folks over in nursing and psychology and public health are making decisions, they're turning to social work literature to look at theories and models and methods and how has social work solved this tech problem. Social workers are currently using technology with their clients. Faye Mishna from the University of Toronto wrote a fabulous paper in 2012 about the creep of technology into practice. We might not think of ourselves as doing technology-mediated practice every day, but we tend to Google where our clients live. We look up information about where our next meeting is. We might text our clients. We might look up resources. The technology is creeping in, but there are several factors that limit the intentional integration of technology into social work practice. So these are some of the reasons why technology is a grand challenge for social work. Now, unlike some of the other grand challenges for social work, which have identified a specific problem, such as smart decarceration or ensuring healthy lives for children, the technology is not a problem to solve. It's a grand challenge, but it's not a problem. We're not solving the problem of technology. These are some of the problems that technology as a tool presents us with, and that's why it's a grand challenge. Now, the social work sector has a long tradition of addressing the most vexing social problems and collecting rich data to serve marginalized and vulnerable people. Mary Richmond was doing this 100 years ago. Jane Addams was doing this even longer ago in the settlement house movement. They would go in and they would collect information about who they're working with and what's going on. The times were different, and so the way that they were able to store and analyze data were different, but they were still collecting and analyzing those data. In a very real way, a lot of our data analytic techniques that social workers are using are similar today as they were 100 years ago. And this is one of the other issues, is that there is a vast amount of data that social workers need to be aware of, need to know how to analyze with new analytic methods, and need to be able to use for the betterment of the marginalized and vulnerable, rather than for increasing inequalities. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. Emerging technologies offer opportunities to accomplish what we do in new ways. And in a high-tech future, the social work profession needs to move away from low-tech solutions and create tech-responsive policies, leverage analytic techniques developed for big data, and engage in technology-mediated practice. Now, this future isn't a future that will happen regardless. It is a future that will happen based on what we decide to do. So the future is going to happen, yes. But we could imagine a future where social workers are kind of on the sideline, where we use technology as it's given to us. We can also imagine a future where social workers are at every single table, involved in the most important conversations about what technological advances are coming down the pike, what they should be used for, how they should be used, as well as actively integrating in our education and our practice technology so that social work is mediated by technological innovations. Both of these futures are possible. And part of the grand challenge is figuring out which ones we have the professional will to see through. Again, there's nothing wrong with the future where social workers use technologies that are given to us and that we sit by the sidelines while other people make decisions. I don't think it's the kind of future that we would choose, but there's nothing wrong with it. So this is part of the challenge, the grand challenge, if you were, to all of you watching, is to think about what future do I want for social work in terms of technology, and how is that going to happen? What is my role in that? So about 3 years ago, there were two papers, maybe it was 2 years ago, about 3 years ago. There were a couple of papers that were written in response to the call for Grand Challenge Initiative papers. And these were the Harnessing Big Data for Social Good, and Claudia Colton, one of the network co-leads, was a lead author on that. And the second paper was Practice Innovation Through Technology in the Digital Age. And that was Stephanie Berzin, who's one of the co-leads, myself, and Chitat Chan, who's out of Hong Kong. Now, these two papers did what we were tasked with is to identify what's going on, what do we know in the literature, and what is a vision for the next 10 years. And so what I'm going to present for the rest of the webinar is I'm going to talk about some of those visions, what we know is going on today, and then what we're looking to do over the next decade. Now, big data. There's a vast amount of data, from computerized records, open data portals, social media posts, web searches, GPS devices, and sensors. And real-time collection and analysis is possible. One of the challenges for social work is that we have traditionally based our decisions on what is known. So if you think about social work practice, let's say it's a child welfare setting, or let's say you are working in a primary care facility or in a juvenile detention facility, or you're working with probation or community mental health or any other setting, you base your decisions on how you're interacting with clients, the programs that you are writing grants to fund, and the policies that you are advocating for based on what is known. There's a lot of data out there about information that we otherwise wouldn't know. For example, there's information collected through GPS devices about where people are. Sensor data enables us to gather information about when devices are being used and when they're not being used. We have information about social media posts, the kind of information people are posting, when they're posting, where they're posting, what they're not posting. All of this data, all of these data, can be used to help us know what's going on with somebody or a group of people, and then we can make decisions. So the traditional way of making decisions in social work about having information and then going from there, we can continue to do that, but the vast amounts of data from these records opens up whole new possibilities for the kinds of decisions we can make, when we can make them, and how they're being made. Real-time collection and analysis is possible, and we see that all the time. When you go on to Amazon to do some shopping, when you go to Google to do some searching, there's real-time analysis of what you're typing in, what you're looking for, and then the algorithms, which are these computer programs that do some prediction about what's going to come next. These algorithms produce real-time results that can influence how you behave. Social workers typically are not involved in the creation of these algorithms, but for reasons that I'll talk about, it's really important that we are. Now, some of the challenges with big data are accessing the data. You'll remember that that millions of people were upset to find out that Facebook was manipulating emotions intentionally in doing what we call A/B design, and that people were not giving their consent to be part of these research studies. And Facebook was saying, well, we're just doing what tech companies do all the time, which is we manipulate people, for good, right? We're trying to find what's going to work best, and so we have to show one group of people one thing, another group of people another thing, and then we see what works best. Like, why is this a problem? Social scientists have long been manipulating things, but we always get people's consent to participate. Social workers can't access these data currently. It's all behind paywalls or locked, not even paywalls. We can't even pay to get access to those data. It's behind these private walls that we can't access. And so having access to big data through social media is one thing, but what about the data that is collected by social workers? The data that you have in your hospital or in your child welfare setting. What about accessing those data? What if you were able to access data from one child welfare setting and compare it to data from another child welfare setting? That could be amazing. Then you could find out if there are differences in outcomes in terms of child abuse and neglect based on a different type of service, a different region, location, training of child welfare workers, et cetera, right? One of the problems is that accessing data is difficult because the data are not clean, right? There's a lot of administrative billing, procedural stuff that is hard to interpret. And also the data are locked behind these these silos. And some of that's for good reason, right? We don't want sensitive data about people just flying around if we can help it. But one of the challenges and limitations currently is that it's really hard for people to access these important social service databases and work with them. We also have the problem of managing and analyzing data, right? Because there are data analytic techniques that social workers are not trained in. We have to be better at collaborating. And so this means not just collaborating with other social workers, but also folks outside of the social work profession, such as engineers and physicists and computer programmers. It's a really important thing to demonstrate success. Now, I've hinted to the child welfare data situation. There have been a lot of articles recently about different child welfare settings using predictive analytics to identify kids who might be at risk. There are some programs, like the one in Chicago, that were shuttered because the data weren't cleaned and the programs weren't working very well. There have been others, such as the one in Pittsburgh, which there are some reports that is working better than in other places. One of the co-authors of the Big Data Grand Challenge paper has been working with Pittsburgh on this predictive analytics program. And I'm not going to make a statement about whether this is a good program or a bad program, but I will say that it's important to have social workers at the table who know, for example, the child welfare system, who can understand what the data look like and how it needs to be cleaned, and then how to analyze it. Whose data should we be looking at if we're going to predict which kids are most likely to be the victims of abuse or neglect? We also have to recognize that that big data in and of itself is not a neutral thing, right? Big data is reflective of those who have done the programming. So, for example, if you have a programmer that is making what they think of as kind of an innocent programming decision about how to recognize images, you can get a situation like what happens with Google, where Google Images can't distinguish black men from gorillas currently. This is a problem, and this is a reflection of those people who are doing the programming. Back to the child welfare example, we need to be able to demonstrate that the outcomes that we feel that are important are actually happening as a result of the programming. And if we have programming that disproportionately identifies African American youth as being at increased risk for abuse and neglect, then we're just going to perpetuate decades of racism, of disproportionality that we've seen in the child welfare setting. And so technology won't actually be a solution. It'll be a perpetuation of the problem. Now, this gets into this idea of legal and ethical frameworks. We have to think through, how does this fit with our code of ethics? How is it that we are serving our clients in the best way possible? And how are we serving our colleagues and our agencies, right? Because we have ethical responsibilities to those folks as well. Practice technology. Now, technologies are available and in development that can be integrated into social work practice. As I mentioned before, we have technology that has just been creeping in to our practice. Gaming, gamification, mobile technology, social media, robotics, the quantified self, wearable technologies, they all represent tremendous potential for practice games. So gaming and gamification, these are technologies where things that people need to do or learn, you have rewards embedded in them in the same way that we embed them in games. So some of the most popular learning technologies have badges or stars or some sort of reward system set up. Social workers need to decide, is this something that we want to do? Is this a is this an approach that we think is the best for motivating people and getting the most out of them? And if we're not involved in this, then all of the apps and the games and the technologies that come out are either going to have this or not, but it's not because we have been involved in that. The quantified self. This is what I was talking about with regards to things that we have on our person that collect data about what we're doing and how we are feeling, what we're thinking, where we are. So imagine that you are working with someone. Let's say it's an adolescent, and you get information that that adolescent has only slept 4 hours per night for the last 3 nights. Well, we know that sleep and a good night's sleep is correlated with feeling better, having more energy, fewer depressive symptoms, greater sense of hopefulness. We know that sleeplessness is correlated with increased suicide risk and increased recklessness. If you had this data about sleep, you could proactively contact the youth and find out what's going on. You could work on what they call sleep hygiene. You could address this rather than waiting a week where possibly a crisis has developed as a result of this poor sleep. Now, this is data that we wouldn't have without these technologies. The flip side, of course, is that if you have this information, what do you do with it? And how do you use it? And should you do anything with it? Let's say that you have information that you can't respond to because of what's going on with you professionally or personally. Are you then held responsible for it? Are you liable for it? These are things that the social work profession has to tackle. This is one of our grand challenges, is knowing what to do with the technology and how it fits in with our code of ethics and how it fits in with our practice standards. Some of the challenges are education and training. Currently, we have, I don't know how many, tens of thousands of people that are involved in online education and social work. But how many of those folks are being trained to use the technology in a way that they would use in their practice, whether that be micro, meso, or macro practice? Are they being trained to think through the technology, or is it simply being used as a platform to deliver information, kind of like this webinar? I'm not doing anything meta about the use of technology in this webinar. I could talk about how I had a hard time finding the link to log in. I could talk about how I had to buy a high-quality, high-def webcam and a nice headset. I could talk about how I had to manage the fact that my 6-year-old was sick all night and I had to deal with childcare, right? This is the practical realities of what we are doing that are incorporated with, but separate from technology. So we are not using this webinar as a way of processing what the strengths and limitations of technology are. We're just simply using it as a vehicle for disseminating information. And so with our education and training, if we have tens of thousands of social workers that are getting trained using technology as the vehicle to deliver information, we should also be using that opportunity to talk through how well is this working? What do we wish was different? How can we be involved in creating the next generation of technological tools so that it's better for our clients, whether those are individuals, families, communities, or at a policy level? One of the other challenges is exposure to innovative applications of technology. Most folks that I know are not the first ones to download an app. They're not the first ones to try out a program. If you're working with adolescents, you might hear a lot about Snapchat or some of the other apps that are out there, but you're probably not using them with the adolescent for good reason. But how do you know how they work? How do you actually understand what that looks like? Well, it's a real challenge, and that's one of the things that we need to address. What is the evidence for technology and social work? Our co-author on the practice technology paper, Chitat Chan, did a wonderful analysis of social work interventions that use technology. And what he found was that even though there are social work interventions that use technology, most of those technologies themselves were not being evaluated. So again, it was a tool for delivery, but no information about how well the technology worked. So we need more evidence. We also need financial resources. Businesses spend 10 to 15% of their budget on technology. Social work tends to spend about 2% of its budget on technology. Now, again, this is not a criticism of social work. We have a lot of people that have a lot of needs that are not paying. So we have a much thinner margin of error than for-profit businesses for whom making money is the ultimate goal. But if we're only spending 2% of our total social work budget on technology, that's not a lot of money for advancement or innovation. Some of the other challenges and limitations: flexible and on-demand services. So if you have a consumer that needs services at 3 in the morning, how is it that social workers are going to provide that unless we are up at 3 in the morning? Well, maybe we have social workers that are in Hawaii that are providing services to folks that are on the East Coast, and we can start to have a 24/7 service delivery system. What would that look like? How would we deal with the licensure implications? I'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, we have technology that can create personalized and individually paced services. If I am struggling with anxiety and depression, there are actually self-paced computerized therapy programs that I can go through that have been shown to be effective in reducing those depression and anxiety symptoms. Mood Gym is an example. There are apps that help me go through self-guided meditation. There's mindfulness apps. If I'm suicidal, there are apps that can help me develop a virtual hope box, which can store things that can remind me of my reasons for living. And all of these can be personalized, and they can be accessible when I want them to be accessed. But are these the only ones that are valuable for our clients? I don't know. This is one of the things social work needs to do, is to think through this. What's not out there that should be out there? What is a gap that needs to be filled? On a more policy level, what is it that we are telling policymakers about the lived experience of our clients? And why is it that we are the ones that are telling them? Why are we not working with our clients and with our communities to make sure that they are using the technologies that are available to them to make sure those voices are heard? Why are we serving as the conduit for information about lived experience when that might not necessarily need to be our job anymore? If we encourage clients and communities to have podcast series where they're talking about their experience of social services, their experience of policies, their experience of job training, all sorts of things, those voices can go directly to the policymakers, and not just through social workers who may or may not decide to collect information about that. Now, the societal goal, information and communication technology can be deployed to improve the efficacy of social programs, right? So how well they work in the field, accelerate the pace of social discovery, and transform the social work profession to respond in ways that ensure that technology is ethically used to reduce the inequalities that exist today. So I mentioned earlier the use of big data and child welfare. One of the things that we need to be aware of is that we can use technology to solve social problems, and we can use technology to reinforce existing inequalities. And as a profession, we have an ethical responsibility not to do that. And so this is one of the things that if you're listening and you're thinking, that's right, I know something that is a problem and I see that technology is making it worse, we need to hear about that. We need to be on board with this and talk about this. So the next decade. We wrote a policy brief as part of a policy conference, and there were 3 policy recommendations that we were asked to come up with. In fact, every Grand Challenge was asked to come up with just 3 policy recommendations. Some Grand Challenges came up with more. We followed the rules. I don't know what that says about us as a Grand Challenge, but we did. So the first one was expanding internet connectivity for underserved households. There's broadband connections in 75% of U.S. households, but that still leaves 25% of U.S. households without broadband connections. Why is this a policy issue? Well, broadband connections are essential for almost everything these days. Applying for jobs, completing homework, having webinars, right? Imagine that you are trying to get a job and you need a specific technology. There's a YouTube video that shows you how to use that. Well, you can absolutely watch that video, but if you don't have fast enough bandwidth, you might not be able to see it. So very simple example, but a social equality example that social workers have a responsibility to address. Now, there are programs through the FCC. There are open Wi-Fi hotspot programs in certain neighborhoods, but it's an imperative that we think about expanding internet connectivity for underserved households. Another policy issue is developing cross-state practice parameters that would facilitate the growing trend of telehealth and online service delivery in order to reach isolated populations. So one of the things about social work is that the Constitution says that regulatory bodies are statewide, or that they're state-based. So even though social workers all take the same licensing exam, so the ASWB writes the licensure exam, and I believe at this point every single state uses the same licensure exam. We don't have national licensure, and that's because of the U.S. Constitution. So one of the solutions is to create cross-state compacts, interstate compacts, multi-state compacts. And the ASWB has a model practice, legislation that addresses some of this. But this is absolutely something that we need to be working on in order to address these isolated populations. And they can be isolated even in a geographically dense place. So you could have a population of people with a very rare condition. And if we are not able to use our expertise in one part of the country to address that in another part of the country, then that is a way in which we're not meeting the needs of our clients and consumers. And the last policy recommendation that we made was to create policy that employs linkage of government data to allow cross-system data sharing and mining for research, program evaluations, and policy analysis. And this gets back to what I said in the beginning of the webinar, where you have these silos of data, say child welfare, and they're not able to talk to each other. You have child welfare data that can't talk to the juvenile justice data, even though we know there's huge overlap between kids and families that are involved in both. So those are 3 policy recommendations. You can read more about those, the policy brief number 8 that's found on the AASWSW Grand Challenges website. Some of the other things that we need to do in the next decade are to attract, train, and retain a generation of social workers who will apply big data for social good and integrate internet and communication technologies into social work practice, right? We need folks who are excited about thinking about the use of data. We need 10th graders who love Minecraft and who have a passion for making the world a better place to see social work as their professional home, not computer programming, not law, not public health. We need them to see social work as a place where they can go. Now, if social work isn't a place where they can go and to think through technology, then we absolutely shouldn't attract them because they're not going to find a home. But we want social work to be that home for that 10th grader who's excited about technology, who can go through college and then go on to become a social worker that can use technology to make a difference. We need to develop, test, and refine new interventions that use technology, such as mobile apps, gamification, big data, and the internet in social work practice. We need to initiate and foster stronger interdisciplinary partnerships and collaborations with technologists, computer scientists, software engineers, and business management. I tip my hat to schools of social work that are currently developing cross-disciplinary faculty positions. So if you have a university that's got a faculty appointment in social work and engineering, that is a forward-looking university. That is a future-oriented university, because the future of social work is not necessarily schools that hire people from other disciplines to be professors. It is schools that create interdisciplinary positions where you have social workers that are collaborating in a very practical and institutionally supported way with other disciplines. So we need to do that more both at the faculty level, and we need to have classes where you have social workers and engineers and physicists and computer programmers that are addressing the same problems at the same time. We need to create a new set of standards in curricula and pedagogy that support technology inclusion and learning and practice across all social work schools. Now, one of the challenges has been that we have social work technology. We had social work technology standards that were way out of date. In 2017, NASW, CSWE, ASWB, and Clinical Social Work Association updated the technology standards for social work practice. It includes some information about education. There are some challenges with the standards as written, and there's some things that are really wonderful about the standards as written. All social workers should read those standards. They should also read the Grand Challenge papers, but read them and understand what that means for the future of social work practice. The NASW Code of Ethics was updated in 2018 to reflect, primarily to reflect changes in technology, as well as to do some text updates. I have an interview with Alan Barsky on the Social Work Podcast, well, 3 of them actually, going through all of those changes. There's an NASW webinar about those changes. And again, most of these have to do with technology. So we need to create these new standards in our educational curriculum that reflect the changes that are happening in our standards through the Code of Ethics, through the practice standards. And we need to have textbooks that talk about how to use technology in social work practice. And we need to make sure that those are being integrated into our classes. We need to expand data access and use through investment in systematizing and standardizing technological policies and practices. And this is for funders. This is something to keep in mind if you're running programs and policies, that we need to make sure that we are thinking about what data are out there and how we use them. These are some of the publications that are specifically related to the Grand Challenges. There's the chapter, Harness Technology for Social Good in the Grand Challenges for Social Work and Technology text. There are these policy recommendations. There are the 2 Grand Challenge papers, right? Practice innovation through technology in the digital age and harnessing big data for social good. And we have a Facebook group that folks can join. You can also sign up for more information. You can go to the AASWSW website if you have more questions about what social work is doing to harness technology for social good. So thank you, and I'm going to open it up to questions now.
Hi, so for everyone who's on with us today, there are 2 options for asking your questions. One of which is just to go to the right side of your screen. The second icon down is a chat box. So if you'd prefer to just type a question, I can voice it to Jonathan and have him answer it. The other option is to unmute your mic, which is another icon on the right side of the screen that says audio on with a microphone. So feel free to do that, but please do be aware of any background noise. Okay, and I'm not seeing any mics come on, and I've gotten one chat from Rick Barth. Can you imagine an IT-intensive field placement that would meet foundation requirements, advanced standing requirements?
Thank you, Rick. The an IT-intensive field placement, I can absolutely imagine an IT-intensive field placement. If we think about IT in terms of the use of technology to deliver services, one of the places that might be an excellent training ground would be a chat-based hotline. So this would be a setting where folks are provided detailed training on how to work with folks in crisis, which is important for social work because the only kind of crisis that any social worker is sure to work with during their career is somebody in crisis. So they're trained in crisis intervention, and they're trained in how to use technology to address things that traditional social work education has had a hard time grappling with. Like, how do we get information about somebody's mood, about somebody's thoughts when we're not able to look at them, when we're not able to see them in person? How do we use our words in a text-based setting with emojis or emoticons to communicate? Now, most hotlines are not staffed by LCSWs or licensed social workers, but this isn't something that needs to be the case. This is something that could change. So that's one field placement that I could imagine that has a high-tech component in terms of delivery of services that could be really outstanding for social workers.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have another question from Pat Shelley. Hi, Jonathan. Does CSWE now look at how schools teach tech for their reaccreditation processes now?
I do not believe that CSWE, the EPAS standards, the 2015 EPAS standards, I don't believe that they have a tech standard. I believe that some schools are looking at the outcomes, and they are incorporating technology into those outcomes. I know that I was part of a futures task force for CSWE, and we just finished a year-long process where we were envisioning the future of social work. And that was with Angela McLean, who's the CEO of NASW, Darla Coffey, who's the CEO and president of CSWE. We had the head of NAD, Martell Teasley, who's also the dean at Utah, and a whole bunch of other luminaries, Sandra Cruz from Howard. And we thought through the future of social work. And this process that we went through is going to be used for CSWE's strategic plan, and it's going to be, I believe, it's going to be used in their process to come up with the 2022 education policies and accreditation standards. And I would bet the farm, it could be the digital farm or an Apple farm, whatever kind of farm you want, that you would have technology standards embedded in the new EPAS guidelines. But again, those are a few years out.
Great. Next question is from Maria Duggan. What do you think of the VA's use of practice and training tech?
I don't know. I know folks who work at the VA, and I work a lot with folks who are involved in suicide prevention through the VA, but I'm not personally familiar with those programs. Sorry.
Okay.
Hello?
Hi. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Ernesto. I have an app called Social Work Mentor, and I wanted to get your thoughts on applications that kind of serve as a practice guide for workers or supervisors potentially out in the field maybe, where they are able to identify like a certain scenario if they can't reach a youth or something like that. So the guide would, based on the scenario they select, have give access to the tool or maybe a solution focused question or something that they could use to apply to that scenario that would be contingent upon whatever scenario they're selecting. So just the idea of having some practice guide that's accessible for workers potentially out in the field that will guide their practice. Thank you.
You're welcome. Ernesto, thank you so much for that question and for that example. I think that's an excellent example of a social work developed app that meets the needs of people in the field in a way that something that you just download from the App Store won't be able to do. I know that Tarsum Singh over in the UK developed an ethics app that provided scenarios for different ethical dilemmas and addressed the what the ethical principles were and helped somebody work through what how to resolve that ethical dilemma. What you're talking about is kind of a choose your own adventure way of thinking through a practice scenario with some very specific responses. I think that there are possibilities for geolocated textbooks where students are get a digital ebook, which and it doesn't just have to be students, but primarily students have a digital ebook where they get some information, and then they actually have to go to a location, which is then geolocated. And once they get to that location, then information is downloaded onto their app or their Kindle or whatever it is that they're using, which then provides them the next set of information for solving the problem, for understanding the scenario. It takes social work education out of the classroom and into the field. And I think that this sort of application of technology has the possibility for revolutionizing the way that we train workers in the field and social work students in the classroom.
Okay, thank you, Ernesto. Next question is from Suba. How can social worker professionals market themselves in human-centered innovations in big IT companies whose code of ethics are not necessarily the same as social work professionals?
It's a beautiful question. So one of the things that we know is that works about getting your foot in the door is knowing somebody. And you know, there's a saying, the best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago, and the second best time is right now. So we might not have a lot of social workers that are in these big tech companies, but we should. You know, this speaks to Rick's question earlier. If there was a way that we could have a field placement in Cupertino with Apple or with Google, then we would have people who would sort of grow up into these settings, and then we would know people. Right? I mean, I know people that are in child welfare or juvenile justice or whatever because that's where social workers are. What I would recommend is become friends with an IT professional. Maybe there is a local IT person who has done work for you, maybe works in your agency. Talk to that person, get to know them, throw out some ideas and say, hey, if I were to contact a company, how could I language this? What sort of words or what sort of context could I put on this that would make sense to the company? Now, I'm hopeful that in 10 years when we do this webinar again, that I will be able to provide some very specific examples of what that has looked like because people have gone out there and done it. I know that there are independent companies that have been developed over the last couple of years that look at the use of technology with certain populations. Those might be some places to start out and to start looking for, to see what they've done, kind of the inroads that they've established. If you're not on Twitter, if you're not using the social media that the tech industry is using to connect with people, you should start doing that. On Twitter, you can search hashtags to find out what things are trending, what types of information are important to certain groups, and that could be something that you could use in your efforts, and anybody could. Thank you.
All right. Our next question is from Mauricio. Young professionals with training in CS, data analysis, etc., are usually attracted by the private sector through high monetary compensations, even though they might be interested in doing social work. It becomes really hard for social work organizations to compete in hiring people with these skills. What strategies could be implemented, maybe in-house training?
Mauricio, thank you for that question. That gets to a really important point, which is that social work salaries have been traditionally lower than many other helping professions. social work is one of the few professions that has a pang of jealousy when teacher salaries are mentioned. So we have an issue with salaries in terms of the funding and how much money people are getting. I don't think that social work is ever going to be able to offer a starting social worker $90,000 a year to do basic casework. And so if you have somebody that has the skills that would pay them $90,000 in one job, a tech-oriented job, or case management, we're not going to be able to compete with them. What we do need to do is we need to think about how we can have jobs that sort of leverage both of those skills, and that the funding is coming from the sort of the tech industry, for profit, places that have more money, so that those skills are then valued and paid for at this higher salary rate than traditional social work. Now, this gets to the point of how much traditional social work is worth, and I think that if traditional social work is more tech savvy, and that we are using technology more efficiently and more effectively, then we are in a better position to argue for the value of social work and the need to compensate social workers at a higher level. Thank you.
Okay. Molly Raymond would like to know, do you know any best practice research for tech-based services like chat-based hotlines, self-paced computerized therapy, or qualified self-apps?
There are a lot of articles, research articles out there about the use of technology. There's in our paper, we review several of the meta-analyses that existed at the time that we wrote them. There's a researcher out of Israel named Barak, that's his last name, and that's pretty much all he does is he analyzes this stuff. Chitat Chan, our colleague, he does a lot of work where he's done meta-analyses and scoping reviews of the literature. What I can tell you is that research on sort of direct practice technologies has suggested that computer-mediated services are as connecting and effective as offline services. It doesn't, of course, mean that it's true for every single person, but there are some people that will prefer online services and some people who prefer offline. That we know that hotlines, chat lines are very effective, and in fact, they have incorporated technology to do things like help hotline workers or chat line workers remember content that has been shared in earlier parts of the conversations, which can be difficult when you're trying to manage the affect of the person that you're chatting with in the moment. So I recommend that you look up the Grand Challenge Practice Technology paper, because it's got a good summary of it. The Social Work with Technology group on Google Plus, is a great place to ask questions and to get resources, and folks are sharing resources all the time. And of course, I'm happy to answer anything more specifically if you want to send me an email.
Great. Laura Witkoff would like to know if you could please comment on social workers' impact on technology-based marketing to support nonprofit sustainability.
I'm not sure I understand that question. I'm so sorry.
Laura, if you wouldn't mind chatting
or I'm on the
Hi Laura.
Sorry,
Laura.
Jonathan, I'm sure it's kind of confusing, but I've been involved in nonprofits for so long on the consulting side, helping the smaller nonprofits really around their own resource, requiring resources, and they can't use indirect funding, public funding, for promotional opportunities. So the smaller ones are really at a disadvantage compared to their for-profit counterparts. So I'm really interested in figuring out a way for them to get their message out there in cost-effective ways using spreadable accessible social media that we have. Some are doing it, but some really don't have the infrastructure support. And I'm sort of exploring that. And I'd love for you to comment on social workers getting involved in that, because we hear our clients' stories. We understand sort of the infrastructure of nonprofits. How do we move into that arena and help these smaller nonprofits support themselves and stay alive, basically?
Yeah. So I think that, and this might not be a satisfying answer, but I think this is one of those areas where social workers advocating for policy change is important. Sometimes policies are written with good intentions, right? In terms of like, what can money be used for? I think there's probably very good reasons why there are restrictions on what monies can be used from what pots for what things. But as time has passed and as the landscape has changed, I think some of those things need to be updated and revised. And I think that thinking about the increase in public-private partnerships, the changing role of philanthropreneurship, social innovation, that some of these policies around funding and what can be used, those can be changed. If those were changed, then some of the questions that you're asking, some of the problems that you're faced with would be addressed. Now, in terms of the actual use of funding, it's possible that my colleague, Stephanie Berzin, would be a better person to respond to. She runs the Center on Social Innovation at Boston College, and she's done a lot of thinking about the ways that organizations are using technology for social innovation. So I'm just going to punt the rest of the answer to Stephanie.
Thank you, Jonathan. And our last question is from Libby Houston. My MSW field students have a 2-semester full-time assignment where they choose a grand challenge. Could you highlight a few examples of emerging needs that they could consider for the grand challenge to harness technology for social good?
Well, I think one of the ones that I've alluded to, or I've not just alluded to, I've talked to a lot, is this idea of the replication of social inequality through automation. I think that that's absolutely something that should be looked at. Now, whether or not they can learn how to do programming and program AI in 2 semesters is probably not going to happen. But I think that a really valuable project would at least be to understand what those inequalities are and to see how they are being replicated in different areas. There's the Google photo recognition. There is the programming of inequality into AI, those sorts of things. I think another area that might be a little bit more practical is doing analyses of existing apps where that are being marketed to address a certain problem or issue, and to get a handle on what it is that they are actually doing or not doing compared to what they are advertising as doing. So if they're advertised as being mindfulness app, what's the data or what's the research that supports the types of mindfulness activities that the app is doing? Is there any outcome data on whether or not using an app to be involved in mindfulness is as effective as having something that is maybe with a face-to-face therapist? So just getting a handle on those things, and not just doing a one-off paper, but actually delving in, I think could be a really great assignment. I'm happy to talk more about some of the other things that are emerging offline, so just send me an email. Thanks so much.
Okay, and those are all of the questions from our chat box. If anyone else would like to ask a question, we'll give you about a minute to do that. Otherwise, I think that's it for us.